What if the United States became the very empire it once fought to escape? Think about that for a second. The country was born out of rebellion, built on the promise of freedom from kings, taxes, and distant rulers. But what if, over time, the dream flipped into the very thing it stood against? This question isn't just history. It's about power, ambition, and how nations change when they grow. Stay with me until the end, because the deeper we go, the more you'll see a side of America that feels less like the land of freedom and more like the empire it swore never to be. The story begins in the late 1700s, when 13 small colonies on the edge of North America faced a powerful empire across the ocean. Britain ruled them from afar, and at first, it seemed manageable. But slowly, the weight of control grew heavier. Taxes piled up, decisions were made in London, and the colonies had little say in how they... Imagine being told what to do, paying more each year, yet never having a real voice in the decisions. That frustration built like a storm on the horizon. The spark came with a simple but powerful idea: no taxation without representation. It wasn't only about money. It was about respect. Why should people pay to support a government that ignored them? Why should decisions about daily life be made by men thousands of miles away? For many colonists, the British Crown had stopped being a protector and started feeling like a master. Tensions rose with every new act and tax. The Stamp Act, the Tea Act. The heavy hand of British authority kept pressing down, and each time, the colonies pushed back harder. There were boycotts, protests, and fiery speeches in taverns and town halls. What began as resistance to taxes turned into a deeper demand: the right to govern themselves. Then came the breaking point. In 1775, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. No one knew it then, but history had shifted. Ordinary farmers and tradesmen stood up to the most powerful army in the world. It was an impossible fight on paper, a young, divided people against the strongest empire of the age. And yet they fought. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 turned resistance into revolution. In bold, almost reckless words, leaders declared that all men are created equal and that governments exist only with the consent of the governed. These ideas were radical for their time. To claim freedom as a natural right, not a gift from kings, was revolutionary in every sense of the word. For the next years, the war dragged on. There were crushing defeats, moments when hope nearly disappeared, and times when the dream of independence looked doomed. But there were also surprising victories, battles that proved the colonies weren't just a nuisance. They were a force determined to survive. With the help of allies, most notably France, the impossible became possible. In 1783, Britain recognized American independence. The colonies had broken free. The empire that once ruled them was gone. A new nation was born on a promise of freedom, equality, and self-rule. It wasn't perfect. Slavery remained. Women had little power, and many were still excluded from the vision. But the United States presented itself as something new in the world, a nation that refused to be an empire, a nation that claimed to stand for liberty. At least, that's how the story began. When we hear the word empire, images of kings, crowns, and vast armies often come to mind. An empire is more than just a country. It is a system built on expansion, control, and power over others. Empires stretch their borders, take land, and impose their will on weaker nations. From Rome to Britain, the story of empire has always been about dominance dressed up as order. The United States, at its birth, rejected this idea. The revolution wasn't only a fight for freedom, it was a rejection of empire itself. America promised to be different. No kings. No ruling elite from across the sea. No subjects, only citizens. The Founding Fathers spoke of a republic, government by the people, not by an empire. That was the dream. That was the claim. Yet, here's the paradox. Empires don't always admit they are empires. Rome once called itself a republic too, even as it expanded by force. Britain justified its rule by saying it brought civilization to others. Every empire has a story to cover its reach. And America's story was freedom. But could a nation expand and grow powerful without stepping into the same patterns it once despised? At first, the young United States looked inward. It needed stability. It needed to prove it could even survive. But the idea of empire lurked in the shadows. Expansion was tempting. Land was there for the taking, at least from the point of view of the settlers. And expansion meant power. This brings us to a key question. Can a country grow big, rich, and influential without becoming an empire in practice? History suggests no. The very things America promised to avoid, control, dominance, expansion, are often the same things nations turn to once they taste power. So, what is an empire at its core? It is not just territory. It is influence. It is the ability to shape the world beyond your borders. Sometimes it's through armies. Sometimes through trade. Sometimes through culture. But the goal is always the same, to project power outward to decide the fate of others. By this definition, the U.S. was at a crossroads. It wanted to be free from Britain's rule. But could it resist the same temptations Britain had fallen into? Could it stand as a republic without stretching into empire? This tension became clear in the years after independence, when a young nation started looking west, eyeing land that belonged to others. That story, the story of expansion, would reveal whether America could truly avoid the empire's path. In the beginning, America claimed it was not an empire. It promised it was something new. But history has a way of testing promises. The dream of freedom stood on one side. The lure of power stood on the other. And as we'll see, the choice between the two would shape everything that came next. After independence, the United States faced a big question. What next? The war was over, the empire was gone, and the new nation had to decide how to live by its ideals. Freedom and self-rule were the promise. But land, vast, open, fertile land, was the temptation. To many Americans, expansion looked like destiny. The frontier stretched westward, a horizon of opportunity. Farmers dreamed of new fields. Merchants dreamed of new markets. Politicians dreamed of a stronger nation. But there was a problem. The land wasn't empty. Native peoples had lived there for centuries, with their own nations, cultures, and ways of life. Expansion for the settlers meant removal for them. Step by step, the U.S. grew. First came a Northwest Territory, claimed and settled after independence. Then, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's size in one stroke. To Americans, it was a triumph: cheap land, new space, a chance to build a continental republic. But from another view, it was the beginning of empire building. Buying, taking, and claiming lands without the consent of those who lived, there was no different from what European empires had done across the world. The push west turned violent. Wars with native tribes erupted as settlers advanced. Treaties were signed, then broken. Whole communities were forced to move. The Trail of Tears in the 1830s showed the cost of expansion: freedom for some, suffering for others. The republic that once hated distant control now imposed its own rule on weaker nations at home. And it didn't stop there. By mid-century, the dream of manifest destiny took hold. This belief claimed it was America's duty, even its divine right, to spread across the continent. Expansion wasn't just an option, it was destiny. Under that banner, the U.S. annexed Texas, went to war with Mexico, and gained huge territories in the Southwest. California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more, all added to the map. Again, it looked like empire in everything, but with each expansion, the contradiction grew sharper. The U.S. said it was a republic of liberty. But liberty was often reserved for settlers, not for the people pushed aside. It said it rejected empire. But it expanded in the same way empires always had, through land grabs, wars, and the claim of destiny. By the late 1800s, the frontier was declared closed. The continental nation was built. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, the United States now stretched across the land. It was no longer a fragile republic. It was a rising power, vast in territory, rich in resources, and ambitious in spirit. The question was no longer if America would expand. The question was how far it would go. And as the 20th century approached, the answer became clear. America's reach would no longer be limited to its own continent. It would extend far beyond its borders, across oceans, into the lives of people who had never seen its flag. The republic that once swore it was not an empire was on the edge of becoming something much bigger. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was no longer just a young nation finding its footing. It had grown into a continental giant, stretching from coast to coast. But now, a new question stood before it. Would America remain focused on itself, or would it look outward and claim a role on the world stage? The answer came quickly. The United States stepped into global power and in many ways into the role of empire. The first big sign was the Spanish-American War in 1898. What started as a conflict over Cuba turned into a showcase of America's growing ambition. In just a few months, the U.S. defeated Spain, one of Europe's oldest empires. The victory gave America new territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Suddenly, the United States had islands thousands of miles away, just like the empires it once criticized. The pattern was clear. Expansion had moved overseas. But it didn't stop there. In the decades that followed, America's influence spread wider. The Panama Canal was built, giving the U.S. control over one of the most strategic trade routes in the world. U.S. Marines landed in Central America and the Caribbean again and again, shaping governments, enforcing debts, and protecting American business interests. Officially, these weren't colonies. But in practice, Washington held the power, and local nations had little choice. By World War I, America was ready to show the world its strength. It entered late, but its soldiers, money, and resources helped tip the balance. When the war ended, the U.S. was no longer just another country. It was a major player. Yet at home, there was still debate. Was America truly an empire, or was it simply protecting democracy? The language of freedom continued, but the reality of global reach looked more and more like imperial power. World War II erased any doubt. By 1945, Europe was shattered, and America stood tall as one of the two global superpowers. It wasn't just about winning battles. It was about presence. U.S. troops were stationed across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Military bases were built everywhere. The U.S. dollar became the world's currency. Its culture, movies, music, and brands spread far beyond its borders. For many, the U.S. was no longer just a republic. It was the center of a new kind of empire. Unlike older empires, America didn't always rule directly. Instead, it projected influence through its military, its economy, and its alliances. NATO tied Europe to U.S. protection. Trade deals tied other nations to American markets. Foreign aid often came with strings attached. And behind it all was the ever-present power of the U.S. military, with ships, planes, and troops stationed across the globe. By the mid-20th century, people around the world were asking the same question. Was the United States the empire of the modern age? To some, it was a force for stability, keeping wars from breaking out and standing against tyranny. To others, it was simply another empire in disguise, demanding obedience, punishing those who resisted, and shaping the world in its own image. The nation that once fought to free itself from an empire had become something very similar, only far larger. And as the Cold War began, the United States would push its influence even further, trying to shape not just one continent, but the future of the entire world. The United States has always spoken the language of freedom. From the Declaration of Independence to presidential speeches, the message has been the same: liberty, democracy, and self-rule. But the reality has often told a different story. This is where the contradictions begin. Take the early years of expansion. The U.S. claimed to be a beacon of liberty, yet forced native nations off their land. It spoke of equality, yet slavery was written into its foundation. These contradictions weren't just accidents. They revealed the tension between ideals and actions. A republic that celebrated freedom for some was willing to deny it to others when power or profit was at stake. The same contradiction carried into foreign policy. Leaders said America didn't want colonies, that rejected the old model of empire. Yet the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii told a different story. In the Philippines, the U.S. fought a brutal war to crush independence movements. Thousands died. That wasn't self-rule. That was control enforced by military power. Even in the 20th century, the pattern continued. Presidents spoke about spreading democracy, but behind the speeches, America often supported dictators abroad. If a leader was friendly to U.S. business or strategic interests, Washington looked the other way. If a government leaned towards socialism or independence from U.S. influence, America acted quickly, sometimes with coups, sometimes with covert wars. Iran in 1953. Chile in 1973. Examples stacked up. The contradiction was clear: democracy at home, control abroad. This gap between words and actions didn't go unnoticed. Around the world, critics asked, how could America claim to fight tyranny while practicing its own form of dominance? To many, the U.S. looked like Britain in a new costume, an empire that insisted it was not an empire. The contradictions also lived inside the U.S. itself. The promise of equality clashed with segregation and racism. The idea of opportunity clashed with poverty and inequality. Each generation was forced to face the gap between what America said it was and what it really practiced. Yet these contradictions weren't always hidden. Some leaders admitted the truth. Mark Twain, for example, opposed the Philippine War, calling it hypocrisy. Others, like President Eisenhower, warned against the rise of the military-industrial complex, a system that made constant foreign power a permanent part of American life. But the momentum of empire is hard to stop. Once a nation builds global bases, alliances, and trade networks, pulling back becomes nearly impossible. And so, America kept moving forward, even as it struggled with the image it had created, a republic that preached freedom while acting like an empire. This tension between ideals and actions is the heart of the American story. It is what makes the U.S. unique, but also what makes it vulnerable to criticism. Because every time it spoke of liberty, someone could point to the places where liberty was denied. Every time it promised democracy, someone could point to a government toppled with U.S. support. The contradiction wasn't just a flaw. It was a defining feature. And it raised a haunting question. Was America truly different from the empire it fought against? Or had it simply found a new way to wear the same crown? Today, the United States stands as the most powerful nation in the world. Its military stretches across the globe. Its economy influences almost every other country. Its culture, music, movies, technology, and brands touches billions of lives every single day. For many, that reach feels familiar. It feels like empire. But unlike the old empires, America doesn't rule with crowns or governors. Its influence is less direct, but no less real. From outside its borders, the image of the U.S. looks very different than it does inside. In America, the story is still about freedom, democracy, and protecting the world from threats. But in other parts of the world, the U.S. is often seen as something else, a superpower that polices, pressures, and sometimes bullies nations into submission. Military bases stand in countries thousands of miles away. Aircraft carriers patrol oceans far from American shores. Decisions made in Washington ripple across the globe, whether or not other nations. To many, that is empire just without the name. This dual image fuels debate. Supporters argue that the U.S. is not an empire, but a stabilizing force. They say American power prevents wars, defends free trade, and supports democracy in places where it might not survive otherwise. For them, U.S. influence is a safeguard, not domination. Without it, they claim, chaos would spread. But critics tell a different story. They point to wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They highlight coups supported by the U.S., sanctions that cripple entire economies, and interventions that leave nations in ruins. To them, America looks less like a champion of freedom and more like an empire protecting its own interests, dressing it up in the language of liberty. Even allies feel the contradiction. Countries in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East rely on American protection. Yet at the same time, they often resent the weight of U.S. influence. They see the pattern: America offers security, but it expects loyalty in return. Refusal often comes with consequences. That's not so different from how older empires. And then there's the cultural side. Hollywood movies, fast food chains, global tech companies, these spread American values and lifestyles worldwide. Some people welcome it. Others see it as cultural dominance, replacing local traditions with American tastes. Soft power, as it's called, can be just as strong as military power. In the modern world, America is caught between two images. To itself, it is a republic standing guard over freedom. To many others, it is the empire of our time, shaping the world in its image, whether asked or not. This contrast raises difficult questions. Can the U.S. truly call itself different from the empires of history if its reach and influence stretch so far? Or is the difference only in the label it uses? The perspective depends on where you stand. Inside America, it feels like leadership. Outside, it often feels like control. And that tension defines how the world sees the United States today. Both admired and feared, both respected and resisted, both a beacon and an empire. So now we return to the question we began with. What if the United States has become the empire it once fought against? Looking back, the story is full of ironies. A nation born from rebellion against taxes and distant rulers became a global power that influences lives across oceans. A republic that swore it would never control others ended up shaping governments, waging wars, and building bases around the world. The contradiction is impossible to ignore. America promised freedom but often denied it to others. It claimed to stand for democracy, but supported dictators when it suited its interests. It said it wasn't an empire, yet it expanded, intervened, and projected power like. The ideals of liberty and the reality of dominance have walked side by side for more than 2 centuries. But here's the deeper question. Does every powerful nation eventually become an empire in some form? Maybe empire isn't about kings or crowns. Maybe it's simply about reach. How far a country can extend its influence. Rome called itself a republic, but ruled half the world. Britain spoke of civilization, but built its wealth on conquest. And the United States speaks of freedom while holding a presence in nearly every corner of the globe. For Americans, this creates a choice. Is the U.S. a guardian of freedom, using its strength to protect and stabilize the world? Or is it repeating the same cycle of empire, just with different words, different tools, and a different face? History doesn't give easy answers. What it does show is that power changes nations, no matter how noble their beginnings. For the rest of the world, the perspective is just as divided. Some see the U.S. as a force that deters aggression, supports allies, and opens doors to opportunity. Others see it as an empire that enforces its will, punishes its rivals, and spreads its culture whether people want it. Both images exist at the same time. Both are true in different ways. And so, the closing question is this: has America truly kept the promise of its revolution, or has it simply taken Britain's place as the empire of a new age? The answer may depend on where you stand. If you're inside America, you might see leadership and protection. If you're outside, you might see control and dominance. Maybe the most haunting possibility is that the empire never really disappeared. It only changed its name. What the colonies once fought against might live on, not in London, but in Washington, D.C. And if that's true, then the revolution never fully ended. It simply turned into something else. The story of America is not finished. The question of empire is still unfolding. And perhaps the most important thing we can ask ourselves today is this: will the United States choose to remain a republic of liberty, or will history remember it as just another empire in disguise?